All right, ready to dive deep. Today, it's all about your nervous system.
The network that basically runs your whole body.
Yeah. It's kind of wild to think about everything we do, every thought, feeling, even just breathing, comes down to this complex system.
And it's a system that's constantly working, right?
Right.
Coordinating everything, adapting to keep your body in balance.
Exactly. And it's pretty mind-blowing when you think about the sheer scale of it, right? Billions of neurons firing away.
More than all the stars in the Milky Way, they say.
Whoa, okay, that puts things into perspective. But how does it all actually work to keep us in balance? You know, like when we're sweating after a run or shivering when it's cold.
Well, that's where homeostasis comes in. It's like, think of it as your body's thermostat. It's constantly working to maintain a stable internal environment.
So kind of like an internal autopilot, making sure everything runs smoothly.
Exactly. And both your nervous system and your endocrine system are key players in that. The nervous system, though, is really the rapid communication network. It uses electrical impulses like super fast messages to trigger responses and keep everything in check.
So it's like our body's own high-speed internet, making sure all our organs are in sync.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
But what are these signals actually traveling on? I know we're talking neurons, but I'm picturing something like tiny wires running through our bodies.
You know, that's not a bad analogy. Those wires are the neurons, the fundamental building blocks of the whole system. And they have a really unique structure, perfectly designed to transmit information. Imagine it like a tree with the cell body as the trunk.
Okay, so the cell body is like the central hub.
Right, it contains the nucleus and all the essential machinery to keep the neuron functioning.
Gotcha. So what are the branches then?
The branches are the dendrites. They act like receivers, picking up signals from other neurons. And then you have this long, slender extension called the axon, which carries the signal away from the cell body.
So like the main branch of the tree.
Exactly. It transmits the signal to other neurons or to muscles and glands.
So it's a bit like a relay race, with the axon passing the baton of information down the line. But how does that signal actually travel along the axon?
Okay, so this is where it gets really cool. The signal isn't like a simple electrical current, like you might think. It's more like a wave of activity that travels along the axon's membrane. Think of the membrane as a gatekeeper, controlling the flow of charged particles, called ions, in and out of the cell.
So the membrane is regulating what goes in and out.
Mm.
Okay, I can see how that would create some kind of signal.
Right. So when the neuron is at rest, the membrane is polarized, which means there's a difference in electrical charge between the inside and the outside of the cell, like a tiny battery storing potential energy.
Okay, so it's primed and ready to go. What happens when a signal comes along? Does it disrupt that balance?
Exactly. When a signal arrives, it triggers a cascade of events, kind of like dominoes falling. Special channels in the membrane open up, allowing sodium ions to rush in.
And sodium ions have a positive charge, right?
Yep. So this influx of positive charge causes depolarization, shifting the electrical balance.
So it's like a surge of energy, flipping the switch.
Yeah. And that triggers the next section of the membrane to do the same, propelling the signal down the axon. Then, almost immediately, potassium ions flow out, restoring the original balance.
So it's like a rapid cycle of flipping the switch on and off, creating this wave of electrical activity.
You got it. That's the nerve impulse in action. And, you know, there's something else that helps speed up that signal, the myelin sheath.
Oh, right. I've heard of that. Doesn't it act like insulation?
You're right. In many neurons, the axon is wrapped in this fatty substance called myelin, produced by these special cells called Schwann cells. And yeah, this myelin sheath acts like insulation on an electrical wire, preventing signal loss and speeding up the transmission.
So it's like having express lanes for the signal, bypassing all the traffic.
Exactly. It allows for super fast communication, which is crucial for things like reflexes and coordinated movements.
Makes sense. So we've got this electrical impulse zooming down the axon. But how does it actually jump to the next neuron? Is there like a physical bridge between them?
That's where the synapse comes in, the junction between two neurons. And here's the thing, the electrical signal gets converted into a chemical signal.
A chemical signal, so it's switching languages mid-conversation.
You could say that. The axon of the transmitting neuron ends in a little bulb-like structure called the axon terminal. When the electrical signal reaches the terminal, it triggers the release of these chemical messengers called neurotransmitters.
So these neurotransmitters carry the message across the gap.
Exactly. They get released into this tiny gap between the two neurons called the synaptic cleft, and then they bind to specific receptors on the receiving neuron. It's like a key fitting into a lock.
And depending on the neurotransmitter and the receptor, the signal can either excite or inhibit the next neuron.
You got it. It's like a green light or a red light telling the next neuron to fire or hold back.
Wow, it's incredibly complex, but also incredibly efficient.
Right, and that's how this whole communication network works, allowing for such precise control over all our bodily functions and behaviors. It's really a marvel of nature.
Okay, so we've covered how neurons send signals and talk to each other, but what about the command center itself, the brain?
Ah, the brain. That's a whole other level of complexity. It's the most complex structure we know of in the universe.
It's pretty wild to think about this incredible organ tucked away safely inside our skulls.
And it's not just floating around in there, right? It's got its own protection system. It's encased within the bony skull and then further protected by 3 layers of membranes called the meninges. These provide cushioning, support, and a pathway for cerebrospinal fluid, which nourishes and protects the brain.
So it's well protected. But what about the structure of the brain itself? I know there are different regions, each with its own specialized functions.
You're right. We can divide the brain into 3 main divisions: the forebrain, the midbrain, and the hindbrain, each with its own unique structures and functions.
Let's start with the forebrain. It's the most highly evolved part, right? The one responsible for all the things that make us distinctly human.
Exactly. The forebrain is where we find the cerebrum, the largest part of the brain. It handles our higher-level cognitive functions like thinking, feeling, remembering, making decisions.
So it's like the CEO of the brain making all the executive decisions.
That's a good analogy. And the cerebrum is divided into 2 hemispheres connected by this thick band of nerve fibers called the corpus callosum, allowing both sides to communicate.
That makes sense. And within the cerebrum, there's the cerebral cortex, right? Isn't that where a lot of the action happens?
Absolutely. The cerebral cortex is the outer layer of the cerebrum. It's often called gray matter, and it's folded into these intricate wrinkles, which actually increase the surface area, allowing for more neurons and greater processing power.
So it's like nature's way of packing a lot of intelligence into a limited space.
Exactly. It contains areas dedicated to processing sensory information, controlling motor function, producing language, generating complex thoughts. Deeper within the cerebrum, you have white matter, consisting of myelinated axons connecting different regions of the brain.
So the white matter is like the communication network within the brain.
Exactly. It allows all those different regions to talk to each other. And then, of course, you have specific structures within the forebrain, like the thalamus.
Right, the thalamus. Doesn't it act as a relay station for sensory information?
That's a great way to think about it. It's like Grand Central Station for sensory information coming from the body. It receives input from all our senses, except for smell, and relays it to the appropriate areas of the cerebral cortex for processing.
So every sight, sound, touch, and taste we experience has to pass through the thalamus first.
Pretty much. And then just below the thalamus, you have the hypothalamus, a tiny structure that plays a huge role in regulating our internal environment. It controls things like body temperature, hunger, thirst, sleep-wake cycles, and even the endocrine system, which produces hormones.
Wow, it's like the hypothalamus is the ultimate multitasker.
It really is a vital control center, constantly monitoring and adjusting our internal state to maintain homeostasis. And we can't forget about the limbic system, another key player in the forebrain.
The limbic system. That's the one associated with our emotions, right? Like the feeling of butterflies in your stomach when you're nervous.
Exactly. It's a complex network of structures, including the hippocampus, the amygdala, and parts of the thalamus and hypothalamus. It's nestled deep within the brain, and it's responsible for processing emotions, forming memories, influencing motivation.
So it's like the emotional core of the brain, shaping how we experience and respond to the world.
That's a great way to put it. And it's important to remember that the limbic system is constantly interacting with the cerebral cortex, influencing our thoughts, behaviors, and even our physical responses.
This is all so fascinating. But we've spent a lot of time on the forebrain. What about the other 2 divisions, the midbrain and the hindbrain? They play important roles too, right?
Absolutely. They might not get as much attention as the forebrain, but they are essential for keeping us alive and functioning.
Well, I guess we'll have to save those for next time. This has been incredibly insightful.
Yeah, we're just getting started.
So last time we were exploring the forebrain, all those amazing structures like the thalamus and hypothalamus.
Right, and the limbic system, the emotional core of the brain. Pretty fascinating stuff.
It really is. But we have 2 more divisions of the brain to get to the midbrain and the hindbrain.
And they're both essential too, even if they don't always get the same attention as the forebrain.
So where should we start?
Well, why don't we go in order? Let's talk about the midbrain.
Okay, sounds good.
Yeah.
So where is it and what's it doing?
The midbrain sits right between the forebrain and the hindbrain. It's kind of like a connecting bridge, relaying information between the two.
So like a central hub.
Yeah, exactly. And it plays a big role in processing sensory information, especially visual and auditory input.
So like helping us react to sounds and sights around us.
Right, like when you track a moving object or jump at a loud noise, that's your midbrain in action.
Ah, that makes sense. What else?
It also helps control eye movement so we can smoothly scan our surroundings. And it's home to the substantia nigra.
Okay, I've heard of that. Isn't that involved with dopamine?
Exactly. The substantia nigra produces dopamine, which is crucial for movement, motivation, and reward.
Right, dopamine, the feel-good neurotransmitter.
You got it. And the substantia nigra is particularly important because its degeneration is a key feature of Parkinson's disease.
Oh, right, which affects movement.
Exactly.
So the midbrain is clearly very important.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
Okay, so let's move on to the hindbrain. What's going on back there?
Well, the hindbrain is often considered the most primitive part of the brain, evolutionarily speaking, but it's still incredibly important for survival.
So it's like the foundation of the brain, taking care of the essentials.
Exactly. It's made up of three main structures: the pons, the cerebellum, and the medulla oblongata.
Okay, let's break those down. What about the pons?
Well, think of it as another relay station connecting different parts of the brain, like the cerebellum and the cerebrum.
So kind of like the midbrain in a way.
Yeah, in a way.
Yeah.
It also helps regulate sleep-wake cycles, breathing, and some sensory processing.
So it's a busy little region.
Yeah, you could say that. Now, the cerebellum, that's a really interesting one.
Okay, what's special about the cerebellum?
It's often called the little brain because it has its own intricate structure,
Hmm.
and it's all about movement. It receives input from our senses, muscles, and joints, and then it uses this information to fine-tune our movements, making sure they're smooth, coordinated, and precise.
So when I'm dancing or playing a sport, it's my cerebellum that's keeping me from looking clumsy.
Exactly. It's also crucial for balance and posture, allowing us to stand upright and move gracefully.
Wow, it's doing a lot. I never really thought about it that way. What about the last one, the medulla oblongata?
The medulla oblongata, it sounds kind of intimidating, but it's one of the most vital parts of the brain. It sits at the base of the brainstem, connecting the brain to the spinal cord.
So it's like the bridge between the brain and the body.
Exactly. And because of that location, it's responsible for all sorts of essential life-sustaining functions.
Okay, like what?
Things like breathing, heart rate, blood pressure, even swallowing and vomiting reflexes.
So really basic functions that we need to survive.
Right. It's amazing how such a small part of the brain has such a huge impact.
It really is. So that's all three divisions of the brain. The forebrain, the midbrain, and the hindbrain. They all have such distinct roles, but they work together so seamlessly.
Yeah, it's an amazing system.
So much complexity. But it all comes down to those tiny neurons communicating with each other. It's mind-blowing.
It really is. And there's even more to explore. We haven't even talked about the spinal cord or the peripheral nervous system yet.
I know, right? We're just getting started. Last time, we were exploring the midbrain and the hindbrain. All those essential functions like breathing and heart rate. It's amazing how much is going on back there without us even realizing it.
Right. It really shows how efficient and organized the nervous system is.
Definitely. And speaking of important parts of the nervous system, we can't forget about the spinal cord. It's often overlooked, but it's absolutely crucial.
Oh, absolutely. It's the main connection between the brain and the rest of the body.
Right. It's like the information superhighway, carrying signals back and forth.
Exactly. Sensory information from the body travels up to the brain, and commands from the brain travel down to the muscles and organs. It's a two-way communication system.
So it's constantly relaying messages.
Yep.
And it's protected, right? Isn't it inside the vertebral column?
Yep, it's safely encased within the bones of the spine, and it's responsible for so much, from reflexes to voluntary movements.
Speaking of reflexes, they're super fast, right? Like when you touch something hot and instantly pull your hand away.
Yeah, reflexes are incredibly fast. They actually bypass the brain, allowing us to react quickly to danger.
So the signal doesn't even have to go all the way to the brain and back.
Nope. In the case of that hot stove, the signal travels from the sensory nerves in your hand through the spinal cord and then right back out to your muscles to pull your hand away.
So it's like a shortcut in the system, designed to protect us.
Exactly. It's a brilliant adaptation. But the spinal cord doesn't just handle reflexes, it also carries signals from the brain that allow us to move our limbs, walk, run, do all sorts of things.
So it's essential for movement, too.
Oh yeah, definitely. The brain sends the commands, but the spinal cord is the messenger, carrying those signals to the right muscles.
This is all making so much sense. But what about the peripheral nervous system? We've mentioned it a few times, but what exactly is it?
So the peripheral nervous system, or PNS, is basically everything outside the brain and spinal cord.
Okay, so all the nerves that branch out from the spinal cord and reach every part of the body.
Exactly. It's a massive network carrying signals to and from the central nervous system, the brain, and spinal cord. It connects to organs, muscles, sensory receptors, everything.
So it's like the brain's extended reach, allowing it to gather information and send commands throughout the body.
Yeah, that's a great way to think about it. And the peripheral nervous system has two main branches, the somatic nervous system and the autonomic nervous system.
Okay, what's the difference between those two?
Well, the somatic nervous system is all about voluntary movements, things like reaching for a cup or taking a step.
So when I decide to move, that's my somatic nervous system at work.
You got it. It receives commands from the brain and tells the skeletal muscles what to do. But it's not just about movement. The somatic nervous system also carries sensory information back to the brain.
Right, so we can feel things like touch and temperature.
Exactly. Now, the autonomic nervous system is a bit different. It controls the functions of our internal organs, things we don't consciously control.
Okay, so things like our heart rate, breathing, digestion.
Exactly. It's constantly monitoring and adjusting those functions, keeping everything in balance without us having to think about it.
So it's like our internal autopilot, making sure everything runs smoothly.
Right. And within the autonomic nervous system, we have two more divisions, the sympathetic and the parasympathetic.
Two more. Okay, so it's getting even more complex. What do those two do?
Think of them as two sides of a coin working together to maintain balance. The sympathetic nervous system is our fight or flight system. It kicks in when we're stressed or in danger.
So it's like our emergency response system.
Exactly. It ramps up your heart rate, speeds up breathing, diverts blood to your muscles, gets you ready for action.
Wow, it's amazing how our bodies can just switch gears like that.
It's an incredible system. But we don't want to be in that fight or flight mode all the time. That's where the parasympathetic nervous system comes in.
So it's like the opposite of the sympathetic system.
Right. It's the rest and digest system. It slows things down, calms us down, promotes digestion, and helps us conserve energy.
It's all about bringing us back to a state of balance.
Exactly. And those two systems, the sympathetic and parasympathetic, are constantly working together to keep our internal environment stable.
It's incredible. We've covered so much in this deep dive, from the intricate structure of the brain to the crucial role of the spinal cord and the vast network of the peripheral nervous system.
And it all comes down to those tiny neurons sending signals back and forth. It's mind-blowing when you think about it.
It really is. And it's a reminder that we have this incredible system working inside us all the time, keeping us alive, allowing us to move, think, feel, experience the world.
So the next time you take a breath, feel a sensation, or simply move your arm, take a moment to appreciate the wonder of your nervous system. It's truly remarkable.